The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 1582, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to protect consumers by prohibiting the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency from promulgating as final certain energy-related rules that are estimated to cost more than $1 billion and will cause significant adverse effects to the economy.
To the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
This evening we will be debating H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, authored by the distinguished gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Madam Chairman, one of the major issues that the American people face today is a slow growth in its economy. Our economy has been sluggish for some time. The last quarter of 2012, the first quarter of 2013, gross domestic product grew by less than 2%. And in the last 15 quarters, our growth of our economy in America has been the slowest since World War II. So we need to do everything in this country to promote economic growth. And this bill looks at the impact of regulations as obstacles to economic growth. I want to just read a few of the regulations that have been adopted by EPA since January 2009. Greenhouse gas regulations for cars, and these are EPA numbers. It costs $52 billion. Greenhouse gas standards for cars 2017-2025, $144 billion. Greenhouse gas standards for trucks, $8 billion. Utility MAC, $9.6 billion annually. Boiler MAC, $2.2 billion annually. Now, I could go on, but I think that that shows that the cost of some of these regulations present serious obstacles to economic growth. So the legislation that we consider tonight is simply a common sense approach, a way to review the impact of energy-related regulations at the Environmental Protection Agency. And all this legislation does is this. The administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency may not promulgate as final an energy-related rule that is estimated to cost more than $1 billion unless, one, they make a report to Congress setting out what the regulation does, and number two, the Secretary of Energy, working with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Administrator of the Energy Information Administration and the Secretary of Commerce and the Small Business Administration, will look at these regulations and look at the impact on consumer energy cost, the impact on employment, the impact on economic growth, and the Department of Energy certainly has the expertise to analyze these kinds of figures. And if the Secretary determines that it will be harmful to economic growth, then the Secretary can actually stop the regulation from taking effect. Now, the good news is, at that point, EPA could go back and redo the process. But I can tell you from my personal experience of working with people in my district who are affected by regulations every day, most people genuinely believe that there's not anything wrong by having other government agencies review the impact of the cost of regulations on the economy, on jobs, on the price of fuel. And that's precisely what Dr. Cassidy's bill does. And I think it's a common sense approach, something that the American people need as additional protections. And with that, I would like to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield myself such time
Without
as I may
objection,
consume.
the gentleman is recognized.
This Republican bill is simply a disguised assault on EPA rules that protect human health and the environment. That's why the White House has said that the President would veto this bill if it got to him. Last Congress, this House, under Republican leadership, they know how to dress, but they don't know how to legislate. The Republicans voted over 300 times to roll back environmental laws. Nearly half of these votes were efforts to block EPA rules. The House voted to block EPA standards for mercury, a serious toxin, and other air pollutants that are similarly poisonous from power plants and incinerators. The House voted to strip EPA of authority to set water quality standards. The House even voted to overturn EPA's scientific finding that carbon pollution endangers health and the environment. The problem that the Republicans face is that the public doesn't want more air and water pollution. They don't support these efforts. They're attacks on public health standards that protect our kids and our seniors. The public doesn't want to weaken the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. The public supports our bedrock environmental laws, so it should come as no surprise that none of these efforts, none of these attacks on EPA in the last Congress became law. They all died in the Senate. Now House Republicans are trying a new approach. Rather than blocking EPA action directly, they want to give another agency veto power over EPA rules. Under this bill, if the Department of Energy determines that a rule proposed by EPA would cause any, quote, significant adverse effects to the economy, end quote, EPA would be blocked from finalizing the rule. This bill would set a terrible precedent. If we give DOE a veto power over EPA, where do we stop? Are we next going to give the Department of Commerce a veto over the State Department? Or the IRS a veto over the FDA? This kind of thinking would mean that our government would be so dysfunctional that the whole government would look like the Congress of the United States. Even if DOE does not veto an EPA rule, the extensive analysis required under the bill could delay EPA rules for years, which means more air pollution, more asthma for our kids, more danger to our planet. We have an obligation to our children and future generations to protect our atmosphere while there is still time. We need to be acting faster, not putting on the brakes to benefit the big polluters. This is a costly bill. The Congressional Budget Office says that the price tag for all the reviews and the reports required under this legislation would be $35 million over 5 years. This is money that we don't have to spend, especially since the DOE reviews will simply be duplicative of exhaustive analysis already done by the EPA. And while our EPA is acting, they can give EPA their point of view. And consider this point. At the same time that the House Republicans are telling DOE to undertake exhaustive analysis of EPA rules, they're slashing DOE's budget. DOE could end up with no resources to do these reviews. Existing statutory deadlines for EPA to issue public health standards would be replaced with indefinite delay. This bill is a recipe for making the federal agencies dysfunctional. No one should want that. Let me give you an example of the kind of public health standard this bill is designed to block. During the committee markup, the chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee argued that this legislation is needed because he was not satisfied with EPA's analysis of the mercury and air toxics rule. He wasn't satisfied. EPA did a whole analysis. They got the costs, they got the benefits. It was all quantified. Every year, EPA standards will help reduce mercury pollution, prevent up to 11,000 premature deaths, deliver up to $90 billion in benefits to the nation. But this individual member wasn't satisfied. It's a tremendous success story that will deliver up to $9 of benefits for every $1 spent. That's what EPA was proposing to do. No member of Congress, no other department should stop those kinds of regulations from being put in place. The fact that this rule is the poster child for the kind of public health rule this legislation is designed to block shows just how misguided this legislation truly is. This bill is deeply flawed. It is a veiled assault on critical public health and environmental protections. I urge all members to oppose this latest Republican attempt to gut our nation's cornerstone environmental laws, which were adopted by bipartisan votes. And now the Republicans, in a partisan way, are trying to make sure those laws do not work to protect public health and the environment. Madam Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Now, I might say with all due respect to my friend from California that he is exactly correct. I was not satisfied with Utility MAC, but primarily because EPA misled the American people. Publicly, they were always talking about the mercury reductions and that the benefits would come from mercury reductions, and yet at the hearing, EPA's own analysis showed that the benefits were not there from mercury reductions. The benefits were there from particulate matter reduction. So I don't see why they deliberately misled the American people on that. And I might just make one other brief comment. We were talking about the money involved by the Department of Energy in implementing this bill. And at the end of fiscal year 2012, the Department of Energy had over $2.36 billion in excess carryover balances. At this time, I'd like to yield to Dr. Cassidy, the author of this bill, 5 minutes.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Upton, Chairman Whitfield, and their staff for their hard work in preparing this important legislation and bringing to the House floor, which, by the way, passed the committee with bipartisan support. Currently, millions of Americans are unemployed or underemployed. Millions more have left the labor force entirely. The economy continues to struggle to recover. This is particularly true among blue-collar workers who have traditionally been employed in mining, manufacturing, and construction. And those three are related because the mining, the bringing of resources from underneath the ground, fuels literally the energy-intensive manufacturing enterprises, which will then go on to make steel, use the steel to construct pipelines, or first make steel pipes, then to construct pipelines. It is an energy-intensive economy that brings good jobs with good benefits to blue-collar workers. I have no clue why folks on the other side of the aisle are so hostile to our blue-collar workers. Well, we have all these millions unemployed. The EPA has been advancing an expansive regulatory assault on the production, distribution of affordable and reliable energy. Now, by the way, current regulations don't change. This does not roll back anything. This is only about prospective regulations. So if there's a concern about Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, those regulations as they've currently been enforced remain the same. It's just that numerous new regulations have created uncertainty, contributing to an unprecedented number of announced power plant shutdowns, destroying blue-collar jobs, increasing energy costs for manufacturers, and raising concern regarding electrical grid reliability. Although the EPA attributes large public health benefits to billion-dollar regulations, their scientific analysis has been sharply criticized, with one public health expert saying their method of analysis is misleading to public policy makers. Another, the National Academy of Science, on a formaldehyde rule, saying that the conclusions were not justified by the methodology or the research that was presented. Now, we are using faulty research to justify the destruction of blue-collar jobs. I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to be for this, but some are not. Now, there are concerns that the EPA ignores the significant public health costs associated with energy prices and resultant job losses. I'm a doc. I know that when someone loses their job with good benefits and goes on something like Medicaid, their health suffers. There's a researcher, Dr. Till von Wachter, currently an associate professor of economics at UCLA, who testified that job losses can lead to significant reductions in life expectancy of 1 to 1.5 years. This isn't just the parent, the worker, it's their children as well. And that's so well documented, and yet folks are just cavalier and casual about the job losses that EPA regulation brings about. Now, when energy becomes expensive or unreliable, public health is threatened, as that research shows. All we're asking for here is accountability and transparency to determine the full impact of EPA's major energy-related regulations, the impact it will have on jobs, energy prices, our nation's economy. If the benefit outweighs the cost, the rule goes forward. But if the cost greatly outweighs the benefit, then let's just stick up for the blue-collar worker, her family. Let's just stick up for them so maybe they don't have to go on government dependency. By the way, it's not unprecedented. OMB has previously put a hold on EPA rules, and EPA has the right to put a hold on Army Corps of Engineer rulings. Commonly, agencies are accountable to one another. All we ask is that the EPA will be accountable to the Department of Energy, but, if you will, to the American people. Now, this rule requires that if the energy rules are appropriately reviewed by the Secretary of Energy, consulting with the other relevant agencies to determine whether the proposed rules will cause significant adverse effects to the economy. If this review takes place and it does not outweigh the benefits, then the rule is put on hold. And by so doing, the legislation ensures energy cost and economic and job impacts are given appropriate consideration. It is important to note, again, nothing in the legislation prevents consideration of both cost and benefits in the proposed rule, and an independent and thorough review by federal departments with expertise in energy and economic analysis is merely a check, merely a call for EPA to be transparent, which they have not been in the past. The bill will protect consumers from higher energy prices by providing additional oversight. Can I have 15 seconds?
I'd like to yield the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
The bill protects consumers from higher energy prices by providing additional oversight on EPA's most expensive rules that regulate the production, supply, distribution, and use of energy. Most importantly, it protects blue-collar jobs from construction by an overzealous bureaucrat who just decides because they have something that they want to do and they don't wish to be transparent about it, it is okay to destroy blue-collar jobs. I urge all members to support H.R. 1582, the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'm pleased at this time to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the subcommittee from which this bill emerged, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this horrendous bill, H.R. 1582. Mr. Speaker, although this bill is called the Energy Consumers Relief Act, a more appropriate title would be the Shamelessly Blocking Public Health Protection Act. And while the gentleman from Louisiana and the rest of my Republican colleagues may attempt to fool the American people into thinking that this is some kind of a jobs bill, the fact of the matter is as the Republican leadership admitted on national television a few days ago, the majority party is not interested in working on legislation to address the real problems that American families face, but rather they are more concerned with trying to overturn and undo any and all of the initiatives that the president has already accomplished. Whatever President Obama has done, the Republicans want to undo. So, Madam Speaker, while the majority party proudly wears the label as the leaders of one of the most ineffective, do-nothing Congresses of all times, we are here today, yet again, spending valuable time debating yet another rhetorical, meaningless message bill that will never ever become law, instead of working on real problems that confront the American people. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to say enough is enough. Let us get back to the business of governing by working on legislation to put Americans back to work and to get our economy running at full steam once again for the benefit of all the American people. Instead, Madam Speaker, we are here debating a bill that we know, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle know, a bill that is dead on arrival in the Senate due to its radical and extreme positions. Make no mistake about it, Madam Speaker, this bill is not about making government more open, more accountable to the American people. In fact, the opposite is true. This bill is simply and solely about blocking the EPA from finalizing rules that will make our air and our water cleaner and help avert catastrophic climate change. Madam Speaker, this bill has many problems, but its most egregious flaw is that it gives the Department of Energy an unprecedented veto over the most important EPA rules to protect human health and to protect our nation's environment. Madam Speaker, the EPA regulations most likely to be delayed, most likely to be destroyed by this legislation have tremendous benefits for human health and the environment, including money saved on energy bills and at the gas pump, reductions in emissions of toxic pollutants that cause cancer and development delays in children, hospitalizations that will be averted, prevention of asthma attacks and premature deaths, all of which provide real benefits to the American people, real people. Madam Speaker, the title of this bill is the Energy Consumers Relief Act, but yet the majority prevented me from 30 seconds, please.
Yield the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 30 seconds.
But yet the majority prevented me from offering an amendment that simply stated that the EPA rules could not be blocked if they resulted in consumers saving money at the gas pump. So if the purpose of this bill was truly to provide relief to consumers, then allowing my amendment would have been simply a no-brainer. Mr. Speaker, you can fool some of the people, some of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. Enough is enough. Let us get back to considering
Gentleman's
real
time has
legislation.
expired. The
Yield
gentleman
back.
from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I would like to remind everyone once again that this legislation applies only to energy-related regulations that exceed $1 billion. That's all that it applies to. At this time, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Madam Chairman, I rise in support of the Energy Consumers Relief Act. This common sense legislation will protect workers, families, small businesses, and manufacturers by providing for more rigorous oversight and public disclosure of expensive and job-killing EPA regulations. Yesterday, President Obama's new EPA administrator demonstrated how out of touch she is by denying that regulations have an impact on jobs. She is quoted as saying, "Can we stop talking about environmental regulations killing jobs, please, at least for one day?" Well, we'll stop talking about it when they stop robbing us of the jobs that support our communities. Within the last month, regulations have cost another 300 jobs in western Pennsylvania. The damage wrought by these regulations extends far beyond the individual families affected. They hurt their surrounding communities where these moms and dads live, work, and send their kids to school. They increase the cost of energy, which is a direct cost on families and businesses, and it is especially painful for seniors and others who live on fixed incomes. I urge my colleagues to vote for this legislation that will protect workers, families, and businesses from higher electricity prices, less reliable energy, and more lost jobs. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California.
Madam Chair, I'm now pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, who is the ranking member of the subcommittee called the Energy and the Environment.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Waxman, for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this legislation. H.R. 1582 is yet another attempt to block the Environmental Protection Agency from fulfilling its mission, that is, to protect public health and our environment. The bill is premised on the false notion that protection of public health and the environment comes at the price of jobs. Simply, it does not. H.R. 1582 is not about transparency or fairness. The bill creates a burdensome and duplicative requirement for analysis by the Department of Energy designed to block EPA from moving forward to address climate change. The people standing in the way of policy to address climate change are willing to subject us to ever-increasing costs of natural disasters, damaged infrastructure, and the loss of lives and livelihoods. Why? To preserve our dependence on a fossil fuel-only energy economy. Proposed regulations are analyzed and reviewed now under multiple laws and multiple executive orders. Rules in the Federal Register consume more page numbers now due to the requirements for additional analyses and documentation under the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Unfunded Mandates Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and multiple executive orders. These additional analyses, studies, and peer reviews have repeatedly shown that EPA's rules are justified and deliver many more benefits to people's health and our environment than costs to business. If and when they do not, either the rule does not go forward or opponents can have their day in court. H.R. 1582 pits one department against another. The Secretary of the Department of Energy should not have veto power over regulations that EPA is empowered by law to issue. There are ample opportunities for interagency consultation during the rule-making process. Regulations to improve our air quality and address other pollution problems have been opposed over the years with the threat that controlling pollution would bankrupt our industries and our economy. That has not happened. We have managed to create a cleaner, healthier environment for our people and have a robust, dynamic recovery. H.R. 1582 is designed to hamstring the EPA and continue to delay action on the looming serious challenge of climate change. We can and must do better. We have the innovative capacity to meet these challenges. The only thing lacking is political will to move forward. This nation did not become great by denying and avoiding challenges. Avoiding this problem will only increase costs and risk across the nation. I oppose H.R. 1582, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman
Madam Chair.
from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, may I ask how much time is remaining for
The
each
gentleman
side?
from Kentucky has 18 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California has 15 minutes remaining.
At this time, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from California.
Madam Chair, at this time I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a very important member of our full committee, I said 3 minutes, yes.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in strong opposition to this bill. As far as I'm concerned, this is just another attack on the EPA. Some of my colleagues have spent hundreds of hours this session attacking the EPA. May I remind them that Congress set up the EPA to regulate dangerous and toxic substances in order to keep our air and water clean. We must continue to support the EPA in this task. Who would not want clean air and clean water? I think the EPA does a fine job in protecting us. My district is one of the highest asthma rates in the country. It is one of the reasons that I've championed clean energy and have argued for strong EPA rules to help protect our children. If this bill had been law already, EPA could have been delayed or blocked from finalizing the mercury and air toxic standards, which set emissions limits for new coal and oil-fired power plants for mercury and other toxic air pollutants. Why would anyone want to block the EPA from doing that? EPA estimates that these new standards will save up to 11,000 lives and prevent 130,000 asthma attacks. That's good enough for me. There are many, many reasons to continue to support the EPA. This bill, unfortunately, does not do that. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and support the EPA in a goal we should all share of protecting our air and water. And I yield back
the gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky
Reserve balance of my time.
continues to reserve. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may I inquire of the manager of the bill? We only have one more speaker on our side. How about you?
We have no other speakers. I'll be closing, and so...
Then under those circumstances, I'd like to yield to myself, and then you will close on the bill. Is that your understanding?
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Madam Speaker, there was a claim from one of the supporters of this bill that EPA is using faulty science to justify its rules. In fact, the proponents of this bill are using faulty examples to try to justify this ridiculous bill. For example, the gentleman from Louisiana's chief example of a faulty EPA rule is what he refers to as a formaldehyde rule. In fact, this isn't a rule. It is a draft scientific assessment that is completely unrelated to the energy-related rules that are the subject of this bill. Now, I do want to point out that pollution control regulations create jobs because they create clean technologies that the whole world wants. The proponents of this bill claim they're worried about jobs and the unemployed. I think they're crying crocodile tears. The Republicans are for the sequestration, which is costing hundreds of thousands of jobs. They are threatening the U.S. with default. They're against food stamps for people who don't have jobs and don't have food to eat. Give me a break. They're not trying to save jobs. They're trying to save some of these big polluting industries to have to pay to reduce their pollution. Now, we've heard that this bill is going to provide more checks and balances because EPA will then have its rules reviewed by the Department of Energy. But EPA rules go through a very extensive interagency process. Other agencies, including the Department of Energy, can make their views known to EPA. The Office of Management and Budget already has the ability to have any concerns addressed before they allow EPA rules to go forward. These rules go through months or even years of scrutiny before they are issued. But this bill creates a new, unchecked authority for the Department of Energy to veto public health rules. That's a terrible idea. Why would we give one agency the unchecked authority to block another agency's rules? There's plenty of checks and balances in the existing law. And then we hear the argument, well, this bill is really about transparency because somebody else should be overseeing EPA rulemaking. But in fact, this bill will do the opposite. The bill creates a duplicative and confused regulatory process for EPA rules. After EPA has done its analysis, they've weighed the risks and the costs and the benefits. They've heard from people who are claiming the costs are too high. They've heard from people claiming the benefits are not enough. Whatever their claims are, they evaluate those claims based often on science. And according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, if we let EPA review all these regulations again from scratch, taxpayers are going to pay $35 million. The bill gives the Department of Energy an unprecedented veto over EPA public health rules. And you know what? There's no public comment when DOE does that. They don't hear from the public. They'll hear from the industry, but they won't hear from the public. They're not equipped to evaluate the scientific health benefits. They're looking at the costs. It's a skewed DOE analysis. This bill is not about transparency. Now, we were told this is not over any simple rules. It's only over the expensive ones. Regulations, it'll cost over $1 billion. $1 billion. $1 billion over a year? $1 billion over 10 years? $1 billion over 20 years? There's no definition of that. They say $1 billion. Okay. But that could then be used to stop a rule that's far less than what people think it would cost. And of course, the benefits have to outweigh the costs before the rule can even be issued by EPA. I want to give a good example of regulations that would be stopped by this legislation. EPA and the Department of Transportation work together on tailpipe standards and fuel efficiency rules for automobiles and other motor vehicles. There are huge benefits. They help consumers save money at the pump. When you have a car that runs on more miles per gallon, you're saving money. We're also protecting the environment because we're not burning as much carbon. Under the rules, by 2025, Americans will be able to travel twice as far on a gallon of gas, which will save consumers thousands of dollars. But that rule won't go into effect because the DOE now has to get involved. Transportation and EPA are proposing rules over their jurisdiction, over transportation and over air pollution. And so these rules, which could lead for consumers to see gasoline at the pump drop by over $1 a gallon, could be held up. And even though these rules are all supported by the major auto companies, including Ford, GM, and Chrysler, These rules will cut U.S. emissions of carbon and pollution by $6 billion. But this bill could prevent EPA from adopting new vehicle rules that will save consumers even more money and continue to address the threat of climate change. This is a very, very bad bill. It doesn't make sense, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it, and I yield back the balance
The
of my
gentleman
time.
from California yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And once again, I want to thank Dr. Cassidy for authoring this bill and bringing it to the House floor. I would like to remind everyone that EPA has made great strides. We all recognize the improvements that have been made in our air quality, water quality, particulate matter, etc. And as a matter of fact, carbon dioxide emissions are the lowest that they've been in 20 years here in America. And yet I would say that EPA is not the Holy Grail. EPA does make mistakes. And I would like to just read a couple of comments from some witnesses who testified over the last year at the Energy and Commerce Committee or Energy and Power Subcommittee. Dr. Peter Wahlberg, former member of the Harvard School of Public Health, testified, "There are major questions about EPA's forecast of serious health effects caused by small increments in particulate matter levels. EPA's statistical approach is fraught with numerous assumptions and uncertainties." Dr. Tony Cox of the Colorado School of Public Health testified, "The use of statistical associations to address causal questions about health effects of regulations is not only technically incorrect, but as practiced by EPA and others, is also highly misleading to policymakers." And then Dr. Ann Smith, an economist with NERA, Economic Consulting, talked about the uncertainties and the statistical models used by EPA have serious flaws. And so all we're saying is at a time when the economy is struggling, particularly now, and when EPA is the most aggressive that it has been in recent memory, as a matter of fact, even though our CO2 emissions are down to the lowest level in 20 years, America is the only country in the world where you cannot build a new coal-powered plant. So all this legislation does is it says if EPA comes up with a new regulation, energy-related, cost over $1 billion, they've got to make a report to Congress. And then the Secretary of Energy, working with the Secretary of Commerce and the Small Business Administration and the Energy Information Agency, that they will look and they will see what is the impact of this regulation upon the cost of energy, the cost of gasoline, the cost of electricity. What is the impact on causing jobs to be lost, or a plant maybe not to be built and a job will be lost, or a plant will close? And so it's not dictating anything. It's the cabinet members of the same administration simply reviewing all of the evidence, doing its own analysis, and then deciding that if it has significant impact on the economy, then they can rule that the regulation will not take effect, at which point EPA can go back, make some adjustments, and redo it. So I think it's a good piece of legislation that provides additional transparency and additional review of the regulation, the impact on the economy, the impact on jobs, the impact on prices. And what is wrong with that? What is wrong with the Congress getting a report back from the agency and let the other department heads in the government review it? That's all this legislation is about. And with that, I would urge members to support this legislation, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in nature of the substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-19. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. For what purpose is the gentleman from California seeking
Madam
recognition?
Chair, I have the amendment under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-174, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Madam Chair and my colleagues and anybody listening to this debate, under this bill, if DOE determines that a rule by the Environmental Protection Agency would cause any significant adverse effects to the economy, EPA would be permanently blocked from finalizing that rule. Well, that's a pretty broad assault on the rules that EPA might issue, because EPA rules are to protect public health and the environment. So if this bill became law, a lot of clean air, clean water protections would be at risk. And the terms in the bill are so expansive and vague that nearly every major public health proposed rule could be delayed and would be affected, because DOE is now going to do this extensive analysis. Well, my amendment is straightforward. It eliminates the bizarre provision in this bill that gives the Secretary of Energy the unprecedented authority to effectively veto public health rules. Now, it makes no sense for DOE to veto an EPA public health rule, especially since the veto would be based on DOE's analysis of the economic impact, which is, by its terms, a macroeconomic analysis. What is this going to do to the economy if this rule goes into effect? Did anybody ever think the DOE does not do that kind of analysis? Perhaps they should have had the Department of Treasury to do a macroeconomic evaluation. They do things like that. But instead, the authors of this bill want DOE to do it. All right. It's outside the DOE's area of expertise. This, I think, would be a terrible precedent. Time and time again, Congress has turned to the EPA to trust the agency with the mission of protecting our air and our water from pollution. The Department of Energy should not have the power to veto the public health protections that Congress required in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act or other bedrock environmental laws. The DOE veto is inconsistent with the stated purpose of this bill, because the other side on this bill thinks DOE ought to do an independent analysis. We would concede it. Let DOE do an independent analysis, but don't let it stop the rule from going into effect. EPA's analysis before they issue their proposed regulation goes through an interagency process. DOE can intervene. The Office of Management and Budget can review it and even hold up the regulation. So let the regulation go forward and let DOE do its additional analysis But don't let that analysis lead to paralysis if we're talking about affecting the public health in this country. So this amendment would stop the veto of an EPA regulation by DOE. It does not stop the Department of Energy from doing its analysis, but it would stop them from, while they're doing the analysis particularly, hold up a regulation and then leave it to them exclusively to decide that they're going to veto the regulation based on a different kind of analysis than one would expect, which is to look at the benefits, to look at the costs, and make sure those benefits are more of a benefit in dollars and cents even. You know, put a price on life. That's what we're talking about. Put a price on a kid's asthma. That's what we're talking about. But EPA tries to do that analysis and has to show that its regulation is going to be more economically beneficial than the costs of the regulations. And of course, you can imagine when they look at costs and benefits, the costs are always overstated. I've seen that in all the years I've been here, and I've been here for decades. The costs are always overstated by the polluting corporation that doesn't want to have to take the steps to reduce their pollution. And EPA, here's what they have to say, but they do their own analysis of the cost to do the regulation. So I would urge support for this amendment. Leave the bill if you want it, but don't give that veto power to DOE. I reserve the balance of my time if I have
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. As the gentleman said, his amendment would in effect strike the provisions preventing EPA from finalizing rules that the Energy Secretary determined will cause significant adverse effects to the economy. And that's precisely why I respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment. All of the debate this afternoon is focused on how EPA is focused totally on health benefits. And health benefits are vitally important. We recognize that. I think I also pointed out from experts that EPA makes mistakes in their benefit analysis, in their cost analysis when they look at cost. And so once again, what we're trying to do with the Cassidy bill is look at health, yes, but what is the impact on jobs? What is the impact on those families who lose a job because of the regulation? What is the impact on the children of the family who loses the job because of the regulation? What is the effect on their ability to provide the needs for their family, their health insurance, their food, and so forth? So all we're saying is that the Secretary of Energy in the same cabinet as the administrator of the EPA would head up an analysis to review the EPA rule that exceeds $1 billion and affects energy alone. And if they decide that it will have significant adverse impact on the economy, then they can stop it. And by the way, under the legislation, EPA would also have to give a report to Congress on the impact on energy, cost, how much will they go up on gasoline, on electricity, how many jobs will be lost, how many jobs will be created. So when we have a struggling economy, the last thing we want to do is to create additional obstacles that really are not necessary at a time when you can do other things and protect health also. So with that, I would respectfully oppose the gentleman's amendment and ask that members vote against the gentleman's amendment, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from California.
I demand a roll call vote on the amendment.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. The Chair understands that Amendment Number 2 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-174. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-174, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 315, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the Chair, and at this time I am pleased to recognize my co-author of this amendment, Mr. Kildee from Michigan, for 2.5 minutes.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my friend Mr. Connolly for his leadership and for working on this amendment with me. I represent nearly 100 miles of Great Lakes shoreline. When I ran for Congress, I made a commitment to my constituents in the 5th District that I would fight every day to create jobs, to strengthen the economy, and to protect our precious water resources. Our amendment would do just that. In Michigan, we know the value well of clean water, since we are surrounded by the largest bodies of surface fresh water on Earth, the Great Lakes. As a kid, I spent many summer weekends with my family at a city campground in East Tawas, a lakefront city that I now have the privilege of representing in Congress. Our amendment would protect our precious waters from pollution. Without our amendment, today's legislation would put the safety of Great Lakes, of our lakes and waterways, in jeopardy. History has repeatedly taught us what polluters will do if left unregulated. We've seen disastrous oil spills, including the Enbridge oil spill in Michigan, that threaten our state and our nation's natural resources. I will not sit idly by and allow the very rules that protect towns like East Tawas and Tawas City, Oscoda, Bay City, Eau Gray, and other towns in my district to be tossed aside for political expediency. This bill, as written, would give the EPA would give the Department of Energy unprecedented power to veto EPA rules that protect public health, save lives, and protect the Great Lakes. Our amendment would prevent the DOE from being able to veto rules that regulate air or water quality. I've heard a lot of discussion about jobs. Michigan's Great Lakes are an economic asset for my state, supporting 1.5 million jobs and pumping over $62 billion into our economy. These jobs in Michigan's recreational economy depend on clean water for fishing, for swimming, for drinking. We must protect them from pollution and harm. Today's legislation is clearly misguided and fails to provide necessary tools to protect our nation's critical natural resources. Republicans in committee have already voted to decrease funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative by almost 80%, something that I strongly oppose, and now they want to make it easier for polluters to poison our waters. I will fight these bad proposals every day I'm in Congress. I urge my colleagues to support our common sense amendment to protect the Great Lakes and protect our natural waterways. I yield back.
Has
Thank
expired.
You.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized. For what
Thank you,
purpose?
Madam Chairman. I rise in opposition to the gentleman's
The gentleman
amendment.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
No, I would say, first of all, with all due respect, that certainly we have no intent of trying to pollute additionally the waterways that the gentleman referred to in Michigan. And I rise to oppose his amendment simply because he would say that this legislation would not apply to any rule that relates to air quality or water quality. So this amendment would exclude virtually all EPA rules from the transparency and interagency review requirements of the Act. And I would just summarize once again, we're talking about energy-related rules that exceed $1 billion. We know that EPA looks closely at health benefits, health impacts, and we certainly favor that. But that's not the only thing that should be examined, and that's what this legislation is about. The Secretary of Energy, with other cabinet officials in the Obama administration, would look at the impact of the regulation on the cost of electricity, the cost of gasoline, how many jobs might be lost, how many jobs might be created, would it have significant adverse impact to the economy as a whole? And I would think that everyone would say, if it does, particularly with the slow economic growth we have today, the last 15 quarters have been the slowest since World War II, and the last quarter of 2012, the first quarter of 2013, a gross domestic product increased less than 2%. So we need to take special attention, provide special attention to the impact that regulations may have on creating job loss and the impact on those families that lose those jobs. And that's what the gentleman's legislation is all about. And I know the gentleman rose with the very best intentions, but I would respectfully oppose his amendment and ask members to defeat his amendment. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
From Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the chair. I rise to join my colleague, Mr. Kildee from Michigan, in offering what I think is a common sense amendment that protects public health and safety. I didn't think it was possible, Madam Chair, but this bill may actually be worse than the anti-regulatory legislation Republicans ran through the last Congress. The House majority calls this latest version the Energy Consumers Relief Act, an Orwellian name if there ever was one, deceptively titled as Congress heads for recess, but the title does not reflect reality. This bill might more aptly be called the Blocking Public Health Protections Act. Shamefully, this is yet another attempt by the majority to gut public health and safety protections so they can give more handouts to big energy producers, many of which, of course, have financed the majority in this House. Not only does this bill block or delay the EPA from finalizing rules, Madam Chairman, to reduce pollution that threatens the air we breathe and the water we drink, it also gives unprecedented power, as the distinguished ranking member of the committee pointed out, to the Department of Energy to veto EPA rules. Nonsensical and a non sequitur if there ever was one. We know rules already in place, like the mercury and air toxic standards, that effectively regulate carcinogens, neurotoxins, smog and soot pollution, prevent up to 11,000 premature deaths, 47 heart attacks, and 130,000 asthma attacks every year. So I ask my colleagues, why are we trying to prevent proven protections on public health? Our amendment will continue to put public health first by ensuring that EPA retains that authority to implement the vital safeguards that protect air and water quality that previous generations in this House on a bipartisan basis believed were necessary and important to protect the public we serve. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I move that the committee do now rise.
The gentleman will suspend. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not. The gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On that matter, I would request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move now that the committee do rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.